Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling a really challenging source. We're looking into the argument that transfer, the old term for ethnic cleansing, wasn't just some regrettable episode, but actually something, fundamental to political Zionism right from the beginning.
That's right. It's a difficult subject, especially now when you see things like the planning around Rafah, these huge camps for displaced people, or the reports about starvation conditions in Gaza.
Yeah.
The source we're examining suggests these aren't entirely new policies. It argues the roots go way back, traced through founding documents, private diaries, letters.
Exactly. We're talking about a paper trail here. Diaries from Herzl, essays by Jabotinsky, Ben-Gurion's internal discussions, military plans like Plan Dalet, the Nakba, post-67 expansion. It's a long view.
So let's start at the beginning. The core premise here really challenges that famous old phrase, a land without a people for a people without a land.
Right, because the evidence presented shows the founders knew very well Palestine was inhabited.
Absolutely. They were acutely aware. So the source argues creating this contiguous Jewish state, the Judenstaat, well, it required removing the existing population. Transfer wasn't just an option. It was seen as necessary, a precondition, really.
And Herzl himself, back in 1895, his diary outlines a plan that sounds almost, methodical.
Yes, disturbingly so. He wrote about needing to spirit the penniless population across the border.
By getting them jobs elsewhere.
Exactly. Procuring employment for them in transit countries while simultaneously denying them work within the areas they controlled. It's an economic expulsion strategy he sketched out. An inducement, sort of.
So less about immediate force, more about making it impossible to stay.
That was the early idea, perhaps the more presentable version. But the need for more direct action, for force, that becomes a key internal debate later on. And that's where David Ben-Gurion comes in.
Ben-Gurion. The source highlights a real contrast between his public image and private views, right?
A huge gap. Publicly, he often spoke about accommodating Arabs. Privately, his writings show a very different, much harder stance.
Like that letter to his son in 1937.
Precisely. He wrote, quite frankly, the Arabs will have to go. But then he adds the crucial bit. But one needs an opportune moment for making it happen, such as a war.
Okay, so war is identified early on as the opportunity, the mechanism for this transfer.
Yes, and it wasn't just a private thought. The next year, 1938, he's speaking to the Jewish Agency executive.
And what do you say there?
According to the source, he stated very clearly, I support compulsory transfer. I don't see anything immoral in it.
Wow. Compulsory transfer, seen as morally acceptable by the head of the Jewish Agency. That's significant.
It's pivotal. It shifts transfer from maybe a regrettable necessity of conflict to an actual sanctioned policy goal.
So if that was Ben-Gurion, considered more pragmatic by some, what about the more openly maximalist wing, like the revisionists?
Well, this kind of thinking provided fertile ground for their ideas. Vladimir Jabotinsky, who founded revisionist Zionism, he'd already laid out the intellectual basis years earlier.
In the Iron Wall, right, 1922.
That's the one. His core point was, stop pretending the Arabs will ever agree to this voluntarily. He said they are not a rabble, but a people, a living people.
Meaning they have their own national consciousness.
Exactly. And because of that, they would naturally resist losing their land. So Jabotinsky argued the only way forward was through strength. An iron wall of Jewish military power.
So the Iron Wall wasn't just defensive, it was about colonization through force, until the other side basically loses all hope.
That's the argument presented. Create facts on the ground until resistance seems futile. And this whole ideology, whether revisionist or labor Zionism, is tied to the idea of Eretz Yisrael.
The land of Israel. The source emphasizes this concept unites different Zionist factions, right? Secular, religious.
Yes. They might differ on tactics or timing, but the fundamental belief in Jewish rights to Eretz Yisrael is shared. And crucially, this envisioned land is much larger than modern Israel's borders.
How much larger are we talking? What are the maximalist claims?
Well, the most extreme versions draw on biblical interpretations stretching from the Nile River in Egypt all the way to the Euphrates in Iraq.
Nile to Euphrates, that's vast.
It is. More practically, even Ben-Gurion, after World War I, made claims to territory in southern Lebanon, south of the Litani River. And importantly today, the charter of the Likud party, a major political force.
What does it say?
It insists, between the sea and the Jordan, there will only be Israeli sovereignty, which, explicitly rules out any Palestinian state or sovereignty in the West Bank.
Okay, so we have the theory. A maximalist territory needing population transfer, justified ideologically and seen as morally acceptable by key leaders. How did this translate into practice, particularly leading up to and during 1948?
Well, the source argues force was always going to be necessary because peaceful land acquisition was just too slow. By 1945, the Jewish National Fund, the JNF, had only bought about 5.6% of the land in Mandate Palestine.
Not nearly enough for a contiguous state.
Not at all. And anticipating this, the source claims Ben-Gurion privately rejected the UN partition plan, not just because of the borders, but because partition itself conflicted with the larger vision of Eretz Yisrael.
So this leads us into the Nakba, the catastrophe for Palestinians, and Plan Dalet. The source mentions something called the Village Files. What were those?
These were incredibly detailed intelligence files compiled by the Haganah, the pre-state Jewish militia, well before 1948.
Detailed how?
They documented Palestinian villages, resources, layout, key infrastructure, quality of land, routes in and out, but also, crucially, lists of inhabitants.
Lists of people.
Yes, specifically identifying politically active individuals, mostly males aged 16 to 60, who were deemed hostile. And the instructions for some were chillingly clear, shot on the spot.
So these weren't just maps. They were operational plans for conquest and social dismantling.
That's exactly how the source portrays them. A blueprint. Plan Dalet, or Plan D, was the overarching military strategy activated in spring 1948. Its goal, according to the source, was explicit. Seize as much territory as possible, especially strategic areas like the Galilee, and fundamentally alter the demographics.
By removing the Palestinian population.
Through systematic uprooting, expulsion, and the demolition of hundreds of villages to prevent return, it aimed to ensure a decisive Jewish majority in the land seized.
And the methods weren't just conventional military tactics. The source talks about terror.
Yes, the strategic use of psychological terror is highlighted. Events like the massacre at Deir Yassin are presented not just as isolated atrocities, but as part of a pattern.
There were reports of horrific acts there, rape, mutilation, confirmed by the Red Cross and British officials at the time.
According to the documents cited, yes, the source argues these acts were intended to, and did, create widespread panic. Menachem Begin, who led the Irgun militia responsible for Deir Yassin and later became prime minister, is quoted acknowledging this effect. He apparently said it caused Arabs to begin fleeing in panic.
Which directly challenges the narrative that people left, mainly because Arab leaders told them to, right? To clear the way for armies.
It completely contradicts that narrative, suggesting flight was often driven by fear resulting from deliberate actions.
And once people were displaced, the new Israeli state moved to make it permanent legally.
Swiftly, laws like the emergency regulations relative to property of absentees were passed. This allowed the state to seize the land and property, not just of those who fled across the new borders, but even Palestinians who were internally displaced within Israel. Present absentees, they were sometimes called.
So even if you stayed inside Israel but weren't in your original home, you could lose everything.
Correct. The source states that by the end of 1948, over 80% of the Palestinians who had lived in the territory that became Israel were expelled or had fled.
And this strategy of expansion and demographic change didn't stop in 1948. The source makes a strong claim about the 1967 Six-Day War.
It does. It argues that the war, widely seen as defensive, was actually engineered by Israel.
Engineered to gain more territory.
Specifically the West Bank and the Golan Heights. The source cites later admissions attributed to generals like Yitzhak Rabin and Mordechai Bentov.
And Moshe Dayan, the defense minister then.
There is a quote attributed to Dayan admitting the Golan Heights were seized primarily for farmland and not security, which, again, challenges the standard security narrative.
And after 1967, this led to the settlement project.
Exactly. Incremental colonization of the occupied territories. Building settlements, Jewish-only roads, checkpoints, the separation wall, slowly constricting Palestinian communities into smaller and smaller areas. The source explicitly draws parallels to the Bantustans of apartheid South Africa.
So a continuous policy across decades. Maximize land, minimize the non-Jewish population.
That's the core argument traced through these events.
Okay, let's talk about the ideological underpinnings. The source argues this wasn't just about strategy, it was rooted in a kind of ethno-supremacist thinking present from early on.
Yes, it traces this back quite far, citing figures like Ahad Ham, an important early Zionist thinker, who wrote way back in 1891 about Jewish settlers treating Arabs with hostility and cruelty, viewing them as sort of primitive men of the desert.
And Jabotinsky, too.
Jabotinsky, despite acknowledging Arabs as a living people, also expressed views of cultural superiority, suggesting Arabs were 500 years behind us culturally. This sense of superiority, the source argues, helped justify the displacement.
And this wasn't just abstract theorizing. It found its way into institutions, like education.
That's a critical point the source makes, how dehumanization became systemic. It references analyses by scholars like Ismail Abu Saad and Professor Nurit Peld-Elhanan.
What did they find?
They studied Israeli textbooks over time and concluded that pretty consistently, regardless of who was in power, the curriculum supported Israeli policy of expansion. Palestinians were, and are, often portrayed in very narrow, negative ways.
How so?
Primarily framed as constituting three kinds of problems for Israel. They're depicted as terrorists, as refugees, or as primitive farmers, rarely as of people with national rights or a rich culture of their own.
That kind of educational background sets a disturbing context for military actions, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Especially regarding non-combatants.
It does, and the source points to explicit statements endorsing harm to civilians. We already mentioned Ben-Gurion writing privately about war being an opportunity for transfer.
But did he say anything about how to strike?
His 1948 diary, according to the source, contains an entry stating that for a strike to be effective, Israel must strike mercilessly, women and children included.
Mercilessly, including women and children. That's blunt.
Extremely. And the source argues this wasn't just wartime rhetoric that faded. It cites General Mordecai Gur, a former chief of staff, admitting in 1978.
What did he admit?
That the Israeli army has always struck civilian populations, purposefully and consciously. He apparently elaborated that this was often in retaliation, but the targeting of civilians was deliberate policy, not accidental.
Purposefully and consciously. That moves it beyond collateral damage into strategy.
Precisely. Which leads into modern Israeli military doctrines discussed in the source.
Like the Dahiya doctrine.
Yes, named after a neighborhood in Beirut heavily bombed in the 2006 Lebanon War. The doctrine explicitly advocates targeting civilian infrastructure and populated areas to create deterrence through disproportionate damage. Inflicting suffering on the civilian population is part of the strategy.
And the mowing the grass doctrine. That applies to Gaza.
That's the term often used for the strategy towards Gaza. It involves periodic, large-scale military operations aimed at degrading militant capabilities, but also, critically, causing widespread destruction of civilian infrastructure and amenities. Basically, keeping the situation suppressed through overwhelming force and destruction, letting it grow back a bit, then mowing it down again.
This feels incredibly relevant to the post-October 7th, 2023 situation. The source connects this history to current events.
Directly. It points to the increased prominence and influence of figures associated with Kahanism, people like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, pushing explicitly eliminationist rhetoric and policies.
Okay.
And it notes the language used by top leaders.
You mean like Netanyahu invoking Amalek?
Yes, a biblical command to annihilate an enemy tribe. And Defense Minister Gallant's statement referring to people in Gaza as human animals. The source presents this not as isolated slips of the tongue, but as rhetoric that reflects and enables the long-standing maximalist goals.
It paints a very bleak picture regarding military ethics. Does the source mention any internal pushback or criticism within Israel?
It does, and that's important. It highlights Essa Kasher, who actually co-authored the IDF's official code of ethics.
What did he say?
He publicly denounced the common claim that the IDF is the most moral army in the world as dangerous sloganeering. He specifically argued that the killing of many thousands of uninvolved civilians in Gaza is a fundamental violation of the ethical principle of purity of arms, using force only when necessary, and discriminating between combatants and non-combatants.
So, criticism from the code's own author. Any other external findings mentioned?
Yes, it references a UN Commission report dated September 2025 in the source material we're using, which reached the conclusion that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza.
That's a UN finding cited in the source. And what about public opinion within Israel, according to this material?
This is perhaps one of the most sobering points. The source cites polling from May 2025 indicating that 82% of Israelis supported the ethnic cleansing of Gaza.
82%.
Yes. And 65% apparently agreed with the statement that Palestinians in Gaza should be considered Amalek. It suggests a chilling level of public alignment with the most extreme rhetoric and policies. #outro. So when you look at all this evidence presented in the source, the century of ideology, the plans, the actions, it forces you to confront something Jabotinsky himself pointed out.
That resistance was inevitable.
Exactly. He knew they were dealing with a living people who wouldn't just passively accept being displaced. The architects of the strategy anticipated resistance because they understood what they were doing.
And you see this acknowledgement pop up elsewhere too, don't you? even from Israeli leaders later on.
You do. Moshe Dayan's famous eulogy in 1956 for Roy Rotberg, killed near Gaza. He didn't just talk about revenge, he spoke about the Palestinians watching Israel turn the lands they lived on into its own estate, and concluded that facing their burning hatred is just the fate of our generation, an understanding of why they hated.
Acknowledging the root cause.
Yes. And even more starkly, former Prime Minister Ehud Barak is quoted from 1998 saying that if he had been born a Palestinian, he would have joined one of the terror organizations.
Wow. Admitting he'd likely fight back under those circumstances.
It's a stunning admission of understanding the perspective of resistance, even while leading the state perpetuating the conditions for it.
So given everything this source lays out, the consistent ideology from Herzl and Ben-Gurion through Likud, the operational plans from the village files to Da'iya, the public support for maximalist positions, where does this leave us? What's the trajectory?
Well, the source implicitly and sometimes explicitly contrasts two potential futures, two paths foreshadowed long ago. One is the path essentially laid out by Rabbi Meir Kahan.
Expulsion, theocracy, greater Israel realized fully.
Basically, yes, the maximalist vision fulfilled. The other path is the warning issued by Professor Yeshayahu Leibovitz, a prominent Israeli intellectual and Orthodox Jew.
What was his warning?
He predicted decades ago that the continued occupation and the moral compromises required would eventually lead Israel towards, in his words, barbarism, and that the final stage will be the end of Zionism itself, destroyed from within by its own actions.
So Kahan's vision realized, or Leibovitz's prophecy fulfilled. Based on the evidence presented in this deep dive, the pursuit of greater Israel, the doctrines targeting civilians, the current political climate, which of those paths does the source suggest Israel is currently on? That's really the question that leaves you, the listener, to consider.